Hey guys, welcome back to Mormon Food Dojo. This is Jeff, your host. Hope everyone's doing well today. So I was thinking going forward with this channel, how can I best utilize Mormon Fu and the subject matter to help, I don't know, people, myself. Obviously, I'll learn more as I talk about it. But create a dialogue where we talk about the how to's. How do we create the defenses? How do we develop, for example, thicker armor to shield us from, some of the fiery darts of the adversary? Some of it, and I have a lot of ideas, and some of it you'll may think's a little quackery, a little crazy, a little wild. But I will tell you that, nothing is contrary, at least in my eyes, and from confirmations that I've had, is contrary to the will of our Heavenly Father. So I'll say that. So I wanted to talk about actually a couple things. I don't want to make these videos too long, like the past four or five. Just those are really trying to get some important, intense information, some background of me, why I feel that I'm qualified to counsel, lead, train, talk about things of the spiritual world, especially in relationship to Lucifer. It's when you get into that paranormal, metaphysical type content, most people would agree that a lot of it, well, maybe not most people. That may not be the right thing to say. There are a lot of videos currently on TikTok or YouTube or some of the other social media platforms where they talk about or try to capture a spirit or a ghost or an entity or and they're entertaining, but they're also very misleading. So let's start with for those who are martial artists out there. We're going to start with, and I kind of came up with this quite a while ago, but talk about energy systems. So in the martial arts, oftentimes you'll hear the word ki or chi, depending upon whether the influence is Japanese or Chinese. I apologize, I'm not familiar with if Korea has any, or Korean martial arts have any name for energy, internal energy. If they do, link it down in the description, please. That would be great to know that. I can add that into the books that I write. So, excuse me. So, energy. Typically, you'll hear the word chakra. Exercise practices like yoga also focus heavily on balancing the internal energy. And how does this relate to us as faithful going Christian men and women in the world? How do we? Well, There's some relationship, and I think I mentioned in my background that, I was a personal trainer and life coach for 30 years. And one of the things that I would talk to people about, especially when they first came, usually like an introduction, trying to, I guess, give my sales pitch to people, is is kind of a diagram, a chart, if you will, of you. Like we'll say, we'll take myself for an example to make it easy. So you take my name Jeff, you circle it, you put it in the middle of the piece of paper, and you surround that circle with 7 other circles, and each circle represents a trait. So, for example, power, strength, cardiovascular fitness, nutrition, mental, spiritual traits. I think that's flexibility. I think that's the 7th one. So, if you want to have a complete physical exercise training regimen, it needs to incorporate all 7 of those. Most people focus just on a couple of them, which is it's great. I mean, that's fine too. I mean, anything is better than nothing. So that's nothing that you can say is wrong or right about it. It just is. But what's interesting, you'll find, and I have found over the years, that some of these traits affect other traits more potently. So, for instance, nutrition. This is kind of a bad word in the fitness world because it's the most difficult thing to master. And mostly because your eating lifestyles are directly related to your behavioral instincts. And our behavioral instincts are created just by experiences growing up. And those experiences growing up, you can categorize into 2 things. One, you can categorize it into experiences that we've dealt with. We had coping mechanisms that worked, and they're compartmentalized into our brain. They're they're stored away and not necessarily forgotten, but they don't have a negative impact. And then you have the other ones that have trauma that's associated with them, and oftentimes that trauma, if it's never realized, then it kind of grows cankerous, and over the years, and most of the trauma is very kind of like micro tears, small, but when you have 100 of them, they add up to, they can cause, some behavioral changes. For example, growing up, especially when you're a child and you ask your mom or dad for a cookie and they say no, that's, I guess you could look at that as that's just parenting, but there is something that happens in the brain when we hear the word no. And it's almost instantaneous. You immediately start to try to figure out, how can I get whoever said that to say yes? And if I want that bad enough, then how do I get it anyway? How do I go around it? How do I circumvent, what is restricting access to that? So as a trainer, that's a huge, huge part. I ask people all the time, what makes people fat? Okay, and I say that because I'm a big guy, and for reasons that are out of my control and reasons that are in my control. But most people, probably 99% of people, will say that it's you eat too much. And I would argue that is the indirect effect of behavioral issues that you have learned over the course of your life that are causing you, as coping mechanisms, to deal with stress, or to deal with negativity, to deal with bullying, to deal with, a drunk father, or an abusive mother, or whatever they may be. We all cope with those in different ways. Food, because it's so easily accessible, and you can argue, well, the side effects can be pretty damning. And that's true. But overall, food is a pretty benign method of coping. It's far better than illegal drugs. It's far better than alcohol. It's far better than cigarettes, or any other behavior that you can think of that would replace food as a coping mechanism. Now, I'm not, I don't have a degree in psychology. I don't have, I do have a degree. I guess I have a minor in sports psychology. And how do I say this? The challenging part is finding out how to restrict something, whether it's a food item, or maybe it's you shop too much on Amazon, or some other habits you have become habitual. I guess that's kind of redundant, isn't it? Habits and habitual. But meaning that you can have good habits, and that's what we try to do, where discipline is part of that. We all like to be motivated, and I would argue that most of us are motivated to lose weight. The missing part to that is willpower. That is crucial. So motivation by itself is not in the presence of discipline or willpower. Motivation is a complete separate entity. It is basically the spark that ignites under your butt to go do something. You're motivated to do something, usually because there's something you are, you're trying to please someone, you're trying to impress somebody, but once the motivation wears off, what keeps you going to finish the task, or keep moving forward? Well, that's willpower. So let's put that on the shelf for a second, the willpower, because we'll cover that, I believe, in the next video. But let me just say that over the years, I've developed a formula, an actual mathematic formula that will teach people how to increase willpower, because that is the effects of learning how to control your will have dramatic effects overall in everything that you do. Now, I am not a master at willpower. That is something I struggle with day in and day out, which I accept because that reminds me that I'm human. That reminds me that, I'm fallible, that I make mistakes, which then gives me the opportunity then, if I'm humble enough, to prostrate myself on the kneel on the ground and pray to my Heavenly Father, and ask for forgiveness, and try to get the strength that I can to go through the repentance process of the things that I have that I've done that are, I used to categorize them as a sin. So of those 7 traits, some of them affect other ones, like I mentioned before. So flexibility, does that affect nutrition? No. Does it affect cardiovascular? Not really. You can still be stiff and you can still walk. So that's not a big, or I have, lack of flexibility, and you can still do, bike riding. You can still run. So it doesn't really affect a lot there. How does flexibility when it comes to strength and power? You could have some arguably benefits by being flexible in either of those sports, because you want to be able to go through the full range of motion to get the maximum power that the muscle belly is able to produce according to your fast and slow twitch of muscle fibers. So, I mean, what about power? How does power affect other things? Well, power doesn't affect cardiovascular, and I say that because power now strength can affect cardiovascular, but if you remember that power has a time quotient that is in the formula, so typically power is more anaerobic than aerobic. So anything that's explosive. And so a lot of times you'll have so-called fitness experts. They will take that part of it. For example, they'll have you run up a flight of stairs, and at the top of the flight of stairs, you're out of breath. Well, let me tell you something. It doesn't matter whether you're an Olympic level athlete or you are someone who's never exercised a day in your life. Anybody that explodes up a flight of stairs is going to be out of breath at the end. That's the nature of a plyometric type of an exercise. It is, and it's not a very good measure of cardiovascular fitness, because it's a completely separate. You're using a completely separate energy system to meet those needs. So that is not a good. Now, if you're and it's highly you're highly exerting yourself. Okay, which again is, if you look at that and just to a real life situation, you know, functionally, then we don't go around exploding into a sprint everywhere we go, or trying to leap up onto something explosively. Excuse me, or we jump down, from a ladder and land on the ground, and that's explosive, having the recoil of a fall. So anyway, so all that together, these are those traits, and all those. Excuse me. Wow, the hiccups now. Pardon me. But so those all create you, and they all have different, and they're all necessary. You can't pull one out and then say that you're fit, but just by definition alone. So you work on those. Now, mental and spiritual, those affect just about everything, and nutrition. So, but those are the things we spend the least amount of time on. Nutrition is huge, and for energy is especially if you're an athlete, you need fuel. Period. I mean, there's nothing to even discuss there. That's just how that is. The spiritual aspect of it, well, the ramifications of spiritual and mental are monumental. If you are spiritually fatigued, if you are going through a spiritual trial or a mental trial, or you're depressed, or you have anxiety, you're anxious, those all affect directly. Those all affect directly into your lifestyle. They have dramatic effects on how you interact with people, how you see yourself, your internal dialogue. So if you are struggling spiritually and mentally, oftentimes that internal dialogue is very negative. A lot of people call it self-loathing. But we're also, as humans, we're also our own worst critic. So you have to take it with a little bit of grain of salt, but we are the hardest on ourselves, despite, the criticism we see from everybody else that can still hurt our feelings. But because we have that internal dialogue, and that's ourselves, we don't necessarily consider that a critique. Maybe we should. So if you take that information now and you bring that over into the chakra type of internal medicine. So the chi, their key, the internal energy life force that we all have. And a lot of martial arts, most of them believe that two fingers, which is about an inch and a half below the navel, is the center point for all convergence of internal energy. Tantien or Dantian, they call it. A lot of martial arts believe that if that is struck hard enough, that you can disrupt somebody's ki permanently. And I would argue that I think that's very true. It's over the years you realize that uh, having a unclogged meridian system means that your energy flows smoothly throughout your body, head to toe, you know, out to your fingertips. That's all. And there's typically, 13, 12, 13, 14 different meridians, that run throughout the body, and each of those meridians have different nodes, different placements for acupuncture, acupressure points, pain points, which a lot of martial arts will use, for disrupting movement, locomotion. There's a lot of places on the forearm that you can hit. You know, Sometimes you'll have martial artists who they'll name it as angle of intent. So angle of intent would mean that you would hit something at a certain angle to cause a certain outcome, cause and effect. I know I'm kind of getting off on a tangent here, but so in the energy systems of the human body, there's seven traits, and they start, one's at the crown of the head, one is between the eyes, one is at the throat, one is at the nipple line of your chest, one is just below that, between your chest and your navel. Then you have one just below your navel, and then you have two, one on each sole of your feet, and they're associated with. We'll start with the feet here. It's grounding, basically. Are you grounded as an individual? Is your foundation strong? And again, in most martial arts, your stance, your legs are absolutely crucial, if not the most important thing. A strong foundation creates strong skills, strong attacks, strong defenses. It's vital in being an effective, you know, martial artist. And you can make that leap over into everyday life for everyday people who even aren't martial artists. You still need to have a strong foundation, and that foundation can be physical or be metaphysical. You can have a strong spiritual foundation. So you have, created, spiritual stumbling blocks, if you will, a brick wall, if you will, that protects you from the fiery darts of the adversary and all its temptations. And you have mental. You compartmentalize things to protect yourself. So that's your feet. If you go up now to your navel, the Tantien, that is where everything converges. That's your life force. That's your energy. That controls it all. And that needs to stay healthy and strong so that your energy flow stays fluid and you're able to control all the other energy nodes correctly. And now above that, in the thorax area, that is typically referred to as a what do they call it now? I'm trying not to look at my notes because I'm trying to be more prepared than I am. But that is responsible for sexuality. That's responsible for sensuality. If you go up into the chest region, that is responsible for love, acceptance, kindness, overall awareness of self and others. Now you get into the throat. Think of the voice. That is your That's how we express ourselves, okay? With words, with singing, with beatboxing, with, whatever, however we can use our voice. And then we get up into the third eye, and that's kind of really like the real metaphysical, where you see beyond the scene, beyond what's in front of you. It's spiritual, very mental, and having a strong third eye, kind of that clairvoyance isn't the right word. You're keenly aware of your surroundings. You could call it situational awareness, and then you have your crown, which is at the top of the head. It's not. It's literally resting on top here, and that's basically your divine source. It is your awareness of potential godliness, if you will. So in the martial arts, when you meditate or when you go into a meditate, sometimes they'll call it cultivation, cultivating your spirit. These are all practices, that can help in, developing a well-rounded physical, spiritual, mental warrior. Now, listen, that's all could be pretty overwhelming, and we don't necessarily need to have. The idea isn't to overwhelm you guys or to, think that there's just so much to do that I'm just not going to do it. No. The idea is just to understand how all these interactions in the human body, when they all are working right, you're happy. And when one goes out of kilter there, then there's going to be an associated behavior with that. And for the most part, it's not. I mean, obviously, it's either positive or negative, but it's negative in a way that it's not benefiting you in a way that it should. So you could look at power. If I want to be more powerful, I have to do exercises that are explosive. If I want to be strong, I just have to lift heavy. If they want cardiovascular fitness, I have to engage the aerobic system in the body, and I have to, push it, strain it a little bit so that you increase your VO2 max, which is your ability to utilize oxygen. Flexibility, that's basically make sure you always maintain good range of motion in all your joints. That especially as you get older, that's a big problem with with seniors. You lose mobility, and you get injured. You get injured more easily. Nutrition, man, that affects everything. But it's also it's the one that I believe, especially in the United States, they take the most advantage of, and they use it against us. I'll give you an example. Sugar. We worship sugar in the U.S., but that is the number one cause for diabetes. It's too much sugar, overload. So if you ask people again, what makes you fat? It's not fat. I'll maybe make that very clear. Eating fat does not make you fat. Eating sugar will make you fat. Okay, you will store, because every single time your blood sugar goes up, insulin is released, because that helps level your blood sugar. How does it do that? Insulin's purpose for blood sugar is it stores it as fat, any excess. I mean, that's a real basic terminology, but for our purposes here, that works just perfect. So having a high sugar diet. Now, sugar could be a number of things. Carbohydrates or sugar. Everything's broken down into sugar. The brain uses sugar as an energy source. But there are things that are better. Ketones, for instance, are like power for the human brain. Works wonders. So when you're doing ketones and stuff like that, it's very beneficial for the brain. Well, guys, I'm already at 30 minutes here. I just want to kind of, there's a lot to unpack there. I know, and as we go forward, we can, depending upon the comments I get, feedback, I'll review this video afterwards and just see if there's anything that is maybe need more clarification. But it is, understanding self is a big part of improving self. I mean, you have to understand who you are before you can make any kind of positive changes. And the most important thing is before you can change the world, before you can change your, something outside of yourself, you have to have that corrected in yourself. To be an effective leader, you already have had to have mastered certain traits in order to be able to teach that to other people. So, again, I appreciate any comments that are down there. If you like what I said, if there's more of it, please subscribe. That's kind of what this channel is going to be. There's a lot of conversation we're going to have. I'm hoping I'll get to the point where, I can do kind of a podcast and maybe get some experts on here that, that know a little bit more about this stuff than I do. That can bring some authenticity to some of these things that I know to be true. And because that creates the validity, and that's a great thing to have, as we're learning, as we learn together here in this channel of Mormon and using that as, I know it can be a silly term at times, but for all intents and purposes, Mormon is a training methodology to help you prepare yourself for, the onslaught of the adversary and, resisting temptation and not sinning, so that we have a more productive, meaningful, happy life. Guys, I appreciate you. I'm glad if anybody that feel free to leave comments. Listen, I like both kind, negative or positive, doesn't matter. I learn from either or. I've been through enough, and I'll just make this, and this will be the end. I've been through enough of my life, and in my current situation, and I'll explain that maybe in the next video, I don't have much ego left. And I'm not boasting about that. It's just that I just don't have any need for it. I don't need to puff my chest up to other guys. I already know that I'm a man. I already know that I'm masculine. I already know that when I walk in a room, I command attention. I mean, that's just who I am. It's a part of me. It's, I've been like that from as long as I can remember. So I understand masculinity. I understand that it's in jeopardy, and I understand that as men, we need to put our boots on and we need to go to work. We need to be men. We need to stop letting the world tell us that it's toxic, and we need, despite all that stuff, be men. And that is a big part that's missing in our society now, and you can see the ramifications for it. And you can try to give me other explanations of why we're at the place we're at right now, but I'll tell you this, that our civilization, as we know it now, is kept up, is run by men. And that's a whole other topic, but for some reason, men are attacked for just being men. And that's got to stop. So, again, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for listening. And I will, I guess I'll see you next time here at the Mormon Food Dojo.